So for the past few weeks, my wife, Andrea, has been teaching herself how to crochet. Do we have any crocheters in the? Okay, a couple. Well, her grandmother tried to teach her several years ago, but Andrea is left-handed, and her grandmother was right-handed. And so even though she tried pretty hard, those lessons unraveled probably as quickly as the yarn did. And so, but a couple of weeks ago, she wanted to launch back into it, and she bought some fresh supplies. She bought those little hooks, and she brought a gargantuan ball of forest green yarn, roughly the size of our Labradoodle. And that gigantic ball of yarn has been following us everywhere over the last several weeks. If we queue up a show on Netflix, it's there sitting on the couch. If we are talking in the kitchen, it sits on the counter like a fat green cat. And last week, when we were off celebrating our anniversary, that yarn rode with a shotgun in between us, rolling back and forth whenever I would take a curve. But unfortunately, the yarn has hit a slight hiccup because it has recently become well acquainted with our 4-year-old Hollis. Parents know the principle. Whatever object you prize will instantly become your child's conquest. Because the other day, when Andrea jumped in the shower, in that brief interlude, Hollis seized the giant green globe and wondered, of course, how far it would stretch if she unraveled it. And so during this time, I happened to come home and I walked into yarn laced through every single room in the house, traveling up and down the stairs, threading through the kitchen chairs, looping around various furniture, and even lassoed around our 2 dogs. And my first words were a less pastoral version of what happened here. I also learned that it is infinitely easier to unroll a giant ball of yarn than it is to wind it back up. Because I went on a pilgrimage, following that emerald line through hallways and door frames, gently trying to coax it free from various pieces of furniture, and just praying that the dogs would stay still. And so maybe out of a little bit of inspiration, maybe out of some subtle PTSD, as I worked on this sermon this week, this image of this just giant ball of yarn being strung all through the house kept humming in the background. Because in the days and the weeks following the first Easter, the followers of Jesus were living my tangled yarn afternoon on a cosmic scale. They had watched as 3 years of ministry compressed into 3 catastrophic days: betrayal, trial, crucifixion, burial, and then, unthinkably, resurrection. Everything that they had known and thought that they had understood became completely unrolled and just strewn all over everywhere. And so in a very real way, they were asking their own version of what happened here. How do we put thought and word to the events of the cross and Easter Sunday? How do we describe a Messiah who breaks every category? Dead yet alive, wounded yet whole, absent yet appearing at supper. Like me tracing Hollis's green trail through the house, the disciples had the impossible task of trying to roll the divine mystery back onto something speakable. 2,000 years later, we are still kind of tracing that thread. Easter, and what happened on the cross, continues to outstrip our vocabulary, yet we keep reaching for words that are bold enough and articulate enough to shape our daily lives around it. Across church history, believers have followed that zigzagging yarn of the resurrection through council chambers and kitchen tables, each generation proposing metaphors and melodies and equations, whatever they can throw that might help wind the scandal of the cross onto a spool that our minds can hold. Within the Christian faith, we call these attempts to do that atonement theories. That's the technical word, which might sound kind of intimidating and big at first, but it is simply our way of asking again and again the question, what happened on the cross? And so from courtroom imagery to liberation freedom, from cosmic battles to family reconciliations, each theory, each image, each perspective slides another loop onto our growing bowl of understanding. And while none of these theories or images that have been used, while none of them can capture the whole strand, they do continue to give us different perspectives or different ways of thinking about Easter Sunday. I grew up in the Baptist church, a rural Baptist church out in eastern North Carolina. And so for my childhood, or for the majority of my childhood, the cross meant one thing. Jesus died so that I could be forgiven, which was heartfelt and sincere and true, but in some ways it was kind of one-dimensional. It wasn't until I started studying to become a United Methodist pastor that I discovered that there was a far larger conversation humming just beneath the surface of Christian history. And learning about this conversation, it gave new color and insight into how I think about the cross and Easter Sunday. In a way, it's like discovering that a hymn that you've sung since childhood actually has 6 more verses, each expanding the melody in directions that you never imagined. And so for the next 3 Sundays, that's what I want us to do. I want us to enter into this conversation together, and we're going to start out by tugging on kind of 3 of these classic theories, not because they're the only ones that are out there, they are by far not, but because they're a good place to start the conversation. And what we'll do is we'll ask how these theories and these different images, what they reveal about God, what they reveal about us, and what they reveal about a world still gasping for resurrection. And the goal of this series, it isn't to crown one of them in particular as champion. For clarification, the United Methodist Church doesn't ascribe to any particular theory. Instead, what we'll do is we're going to treat these perspectives like conversation partners. Voices that help us ponder and question, maybe even argue a little, all in the hope that gratitude deepens and love widens. Now, our first theory that we're looking at this morning is a thing called Christus Victor. That's the name of it. It was how the early Christians talked about Easter for about the first 1,000 years or so. And to fully grasp what it is, this theory thing called Christus Victor, we need to talk about the importance of stories. Because Christus Victor is a story. That's how it evolved. Which makes sense if you think about it. Because long before the internet or things like Barnes and Noble, humans sat around fires and traded stories. It was the way that we understood reality. Every culture on earth has discovered that the shortest distance between raw experience and lasting wisdom is a well-told tale. And that's still true today. If you think about it, we plot our memories along storylines. We raise our children on once upon a time. We judge whether a decision feels right by asking if it fits into the plot of our lives. Stories are the native language of meaning. In fact, neurologists tell us that stories engage more of the brain than just data alone. When ideas are communicated in stories, sensory regions fire, emotion centers spark, our motor pathways rehearse actions. At our most base level, stories are how we think, how we grow, how we decide, and it's how something like faith is communicated best. And the reason that this is important is because the very first step in understanding the Bible is by understanding that this is the place where Scripture meets us. The Bible isn't a handbook of spiritual procedures or a mathematical formula for us to memorize, but it's a long, multi-voiced library in which God is revealed through plot and character and conflict and resolution. This is how the people of ancient Israel developed their identity, and it's how they grew in their understanding of God. But within this vast library of stories and voices, one of them frames all the rest, and that is the story of Exodus, Moses. Every prophet and psalm and festival either remembers or anticipates the God who once heard slaves groaning under Pharaoh's lash, who shattered imperial power and who led a fragile people through water into covenant freedom. Exodus gives Israel's verbs like deliverer, redeemer, hope, and it's their imagination for God, a liberator with dirt under divine fingernails, moving history towards justice. The Exodus story, in a way, became Israel's set of reading glasses. And throughout their existence, their identity has been filtered and seen and viewed through that lens. This matters because when the very first believers tried to speak and articulate Jesus' death and resurrection, well, they didn't invent a new narrative. They reached for the story that was already coursing through their identity. Rome looked like an updated Pharaoh. The cross felt like bondage. The empty tomb was the exodus from death and the corrupt authorities of the world. And so the earliest preaching didn't present a systematic entitled The Mechanics of Salvation, but rather they articulated a drama, a story. God had done again what God always does, break chains and invited the world to step out free. And it's within this story, that this narrative, where we see the atonement theory, Christus Victor, evolving. It's a retelling of the ancient liberation story of Exodus through the lens of the cross and the empty grave. Christus Victor announces that in Jesus' death, God confronted the powers of evil head on and was victorious over them in the resurrection. It's a drama of liberation, and here's how it goes. This is it summed up. Creation is captive to sin and evil. It is shackled under the false authorities and tyrants of this world, things like political oppression and religious legalism, systematic injustice, and the evils that twist creation. The New Testament names these forces principalities and powers, the dominion of darkness, the ruler of this world. And yet Christ enters into that arena without the weapons that empires trust. Instead of a sword or decree, he carries truth and self-giving love and nonviolent grace. And on the cross, the evil powers unleash every tool they possess, shame and torture, public spectacle, death and justice, and they appear to win. But Easter morning reveals their defeat. Resurrection shows that evil and injustice and violence cannot keep Christ dead. In Colossians language, it says that God, quote, disarmed the rulers and authorities, and he shamed them publicly by his victory over them on the cross. And because these powers in our world have been revealed as false authorities, the prison doors now stand open, and creation is invited to step out. Love has liberated creation. Love breaks our chains. This is Christus Victor. This powerful story of liberation language that is meant to inspire us and also draw us in. And it's really kind of that straightforward and simple. But also notice what this theory, this story doesn't do. It doesn't really give us a lot of details. It's not concerned with the technical ins and outs. It's not laying out a formula or a structure. And that's because, foremost, it is a story. And its purpose is to convey meaning, not a systematic theology. But what makes it powerful is twofold. Not only does it give us this powerful story, but it also expands how we think about salvation. Because consider this. A lot of time when we think about salvation and what happened on the cross, we think about it from a very personal perspective. We think about how our relationship with God and how Easter Sunday impacts us directly. But the story presented by Christus Victor looks at it from a very different angle. Christus Victor enlarges salvation from this personal, individual event to a cosmic reclamation project. By overcoming evil and the corrupt powers of this world, the cross and the resurrection are God's response to everything that bends creation out of shape. Things like violence and bigotry and racism and systematic greed and generational shame. And the cool kind of perspective on this is that it tells us that God isn't just concerned with personal forgiveness and the personal aspects of salvation with us personally, but that God is also concerned with sin that has seeped into governments and economic structures, into church hierarchies, and the injustices that have run rampant within our society. When you adopt that lens, when we look at what happened on the cross through that way, well then guess what? The ministry of Jesus takes on a deeper meaning. Because notice what Jesus did during his life. Notice the things that Jesus cared about. Jesus pushes back against the religious authority. He heals on the Sabbath. He spends time with notorious sinners. He rejects the places where faith had been twisted into being legalistic. Jesus also regularly speaks out against economic injustice. He calls those stricken by poverty blessed. Jesus replaces power with servanthood. He elevates women in a male-dominated society. He rejects violence by telling people to love their enemy. Practically everything that Jesus does and cares about during his life and ministry is drenched with liberation and pushing back against the corrupt authorities that torment society. And so this is why the focus of Christus Victor, it isn't on the cross itself, but rather the focal point for this theory is the resurrection. Because what happened on the cross is the culmination of all the twisted and evil that exists in our world, very literally throwing everything but the kitchen sink to end Jesus once and for all. And so the resurrection becomes the focal point because it reveals that evil and injustice and even death cannot control the divine. Christus Victor insists that Easter is news for the entire cosmos, the carpenter rabbi of Nazareth, has unseated every social and spiritual and psychological power that keeps creation groaning. And it bears witness that no pharaoh, ancient or modern, gets the last word. But as powerful as this story is, Christus Victor does come with some tension because, like I said at the beginning, none of these theories are perfect, and it's okay to acknowledge where Christians wrestle with them. Because the greatest threat to Christus Victor is not criticism necessarily from the outside, but a sort of reduction from within. Remember, the early church never offered this drama, this story, as an engineering schematic. It is a narrative hymn. But that has not stopped theologians from trying to turn it into a formula. Throughout church history, theologians have tried to pin this story down like butterfly on a cork. Religious thinkers have tried turning this vibrant story into a forensic diagram, and guess what? When we do that, it doesn't work. It's like think of it like the scholarly autopsy table. Once the story landed there, the scalpel started coming out, and they started asking all those fine, detailed, just little hair-splitting question. Who exactly is the false authorities? Is it Satan? Is it the imperial powers? Is it sin itself? At what moment precisely are the powers disarmed? Is it Good Friday's last breath? Or is it the first gasp of Easter Sunday morning? If evil is defeated, then why do tyrants still hold power in our world? Can a liberation model satisfy our personal need for salvation? This is where the tension is. Stories spark imagination, but formulas promise control. And we like control. Turn liberation into a legal transaction, and you can file it, footnote it, and you can move on, but keep it as a story, and it keeps asking for fresh retelling. It keeps asking for how God might be speaking to what is happening here and now in our world. And here's the truth. That open-endedness, it frustrates some people because it's not neat and tidy. But it also protects the gospel from becoming a math problem. And so we hold this paradox. Christus Victor refuses to answer every how question, yet it answers the deeper what for. It's inspiration, not a blueprint. And frankly, it's up to you to decide, is that enough? The second tension is this: it's political. Because Christus Victor presumes that earthly and spiritual powers can be and often are corrupted. It's foundationally anti-empire. And that was uncontroversial when Christians were a persecuted minority, but it became awkward once the church became aligned with power. It's funny how you see, when you look at church history and you see when Christus Victor, that kind of story started to fall out of favor, it turns out a story that challenges the empire's legitimacy, as Christus Victor did, became less convenient once bishops wore the empire's purple. And history bears the scars. When Constantine draped crosses over military standards, the victory cry, Christus Victor, was repurposed to bless conquest rather than expose it. During medieval crusades and colonial expansion, priests marched beside armies, sacralizing the very violence that the gospel had unmasked. And even today, the church is tempted to trade its prophetic voice for proximity to power. The church is tempted to soft-pedal racism to protect donor bases, excusing economic exploitation because retirement funds depend on it, remaining silent when the vulnerable are harmed by laws that masquerade as moral order. And so the tension is this. If we embrace this perspective into what happened on the cross, it also means that we need to do some real soul searching, because Christians are often guilty of blessing structures that Jesus died to dismantle. And we often turn a blind eye to corrupt empires to protect the status quo. Ultimately, I think this is how Christus Victor can help us here and now, because this way of looking at the cross, it helps us to claim the victory and the liberation of the resurrection. It is the story that proclaims that every chain has been broken and that every corrupt authority has been revealed as a fraud. Consider for a moment what this image of the cross, this perspective of the cross could mean for people in our world who are hurting. It tells those under the bondage of dictators and tyrants that God still reigns. It tells communities under the weight of poverty that greed and corruption will not have the last word. And it whispers to weary activists that the work of justice is not in vain and that God joins them in liberating the world. When we preach this story, we're not offering consolation prizes. We are announcing that the prison doors, kicked off their hinges on Easter morning, are still lying in the dust. That God continues to liberate, to heal, to continues to upend the crooked structures that crush lives and twist creation out of shape. Because here's the truth, and here's where I want to lead us. We need people of faith in our world who are unapologetic about liberation and speaking truth to power. We need believers who are willing to name out loud the lies that prop up supremacy and who are willing to stand between the vulnerable and the empire that continues to harm. Because at this very moment, the false authorities of our world are fully evident. We see how sin and brokenness quickly seeps into everything from government to religious institutions to economic systems. We see very clearly how they twist God's hope for creation and how they create continued cycles of harm. And so we, as people of faith, are called to align ourselves with Christ, with the liberator, and not the ruling powers. We refuse their anxious scarcity. We contradict their violence with enemy love. We sabotage their despair with stubborn joy. And we claim the liberation of resurrection for ourselves, for our neighbors, and for all of creation. This is Christus Victor. Friends, whatever you glean from this window, my hope is simple, that it stretches your imagination wider, and that it helps you see new light on this beautiful mystery of the cross and the resurrection that keeps remaking the world. Through this perspective, may you reclaim liberation wherever there is chains. May the story inspire you to keep pushing open doors, and may the unseated powers know by the way that we live that no pharaoh, ancient, modern, or still to come, will ever get the last word. Amen.